Upper East Side, Manhattan. 7-year-old Oliver hadn't spoken in 9 months. Since witnessing his mother's death in the penthouse fire, he watched from the street below. The boy lived like a ghost in his father's $50 million Fifth Avenue mansion, where Richard Sterling, pharmaceutical CEO, had tried everything. Europe's finest psychiatrists, hypnotherapy, even faith healers. Nothing. Then came Michael Torres, the new janitor, 32 years old, single father, raising his own son. His first day, instead of trying to make Oliver talk, Michael sat on the marble floor and started building spaceships with cleaning supplies, narrating adventures to his co-pilot, who wasn't there. After 3 hours, Oliver whispered, "Can I be your co-pilot?" Richard, watching from security cameras, collapsed in tears. But when he discovered Michael was the brother of the firefighter who died trying to save his wife, and that he'd taken the janitor job for a reason nobody could imagine, everything changed. The Sterling mansion on Fifth Avenue stood like a monument to success and tragedy. $50 million of limestone and glass that concealed an unbearable pain. September had arrived with its crisp mornings in Central Park, visible from every window. But inside these walls, time had stopped 9 months ago, the night of the fire. Richard Sterling walked the empty corridors at dawn, as he did every morning since that cursed December night. 45 years old, his hair had gone gray in patches over the past months, and he carried the weight of success and tragedy with the same rigidity as his Tom Ford suits. The pharmaceutical empire he'd built from nothing continued to grow, his name on research centers across the country, but none of it mattered when he entered his son's room and found him in the exact same position, sitting by the window, motionless, mute. The boy was always there, every morning, every evening, often through the night. The window overlooked Madison Avenue, precisely where he'd stood 9 months ago, watching the penthouse of their building burn, watching the window where his mother had appeared for an instant before the ceiling collapsed. He'd been with his nanny, returning from a piano lesson when they saw the flames. The firefighters had done their best. One had even died trying to reach Catherine when the structure gave way. It was 7 o'clock that Monday morning in September when the service entrance buzzed. Richard barely heard it, lost as he was in observing his son through the security cameras, an obsessive habit he'd developed to watch over him without disturbing him. The new janitor had arrived. Michael Torres stood at the service door with a worn backpack and an impeccable resume from the building management company. 32 years old, excellent references from office buildings downtown, experience with difficult maintenance situations. Richard had hired him out of necessity after the previous janitor quit, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere of grief that permeated the mansion. The house manager, Mrs. Chen, led Michael through his duties with professional efficiency, but even she seemed affected by the tomb-like silence of the place. The mansion had 20 rooms, most unused now, all requiring daily maintenance to keep up the facade that life continued normally. Michael was cleaning the main hallway when he first saw Oliver. The boy had wandered from his room, something he rarely did, and stood at the top of the grand staircase like a small ghost in his Spider-Man pajamas that he'd worn for 3 days straight. His blonde hair was tangled, his blue eyes vacant, staring through Michael as if he wasn't there. What Michael did next would have seemed insane to anyone watching, but he'd learned long ago that children in pain needed different approaches. He didn't speak to Oliver, didn't try to coax him down, or engage him with false cheer. Instead, he took his cleaning supplies, spray bottles, rags, a mop handle, and began arranging them on the marble floor in a deliberate pattern. Richard watched from his home office security monitor, ready to intervene if this new employee disturbed his son. But Michael wasn't trying to interact with Oliver at all. He was building something with the cleaning supplies, creating what looked like a spaceship or rocket, all while humming quietly to himself. Then Michael began to speak, not to Oliver, but to an imaginary companion. His voice was low, calm, carrying just enough to reach the top of the stairs. He narrated an adventure about Captain Mike and his invisible co-pilot, traveling through galaxies made of soap bubbles, visiting planets where sadness turned into shooting stars, where mothers who had to leave for long journeys sent messages through moonbeams. Half an hour passed. Richard had canceled his morning conference call, transfixed by the screen. He hadn't noticed he was holding his breath until he saw something that made him gasp. Oliver had moved. Not much, just a few steps down the stairs, but now he could see Michael's creation better. His hands, which had been limp at his sides for months, twitched slightly. His eyes, always unfocused, now tracked Michael's movements as he added more components to his spacecraft. Michael continued building and narrating, apparently oblivious to his small observer, who was slowly, step by step, descending the staircase. The ship grew more elaborate, with paper towel wings and bottle cap control panels. The story became more engaging, speaking of a young astronaut who'd lost his voice in a cosmic storm but could still communicate through building and colors. By the second hour, Oliver was sitting on the third step from the bottom, still maintaining distance, but close enough to see every detail. Richard saw something he hadn't seen in 9 months: interest, a spark of life in his son's dead eyes. It was when Michael described how the spaceship needed a brave co-pilot, someone who knew about sadness but wasn't afraid to journey toward new stars, that the miracle happened. A small voice, hoarse from disuse, barely a whisper, broke the 9-month silence. "Can I be your co-pilot?" Michael showed no surprise, made no sudden movements that might scare the child. He simply looked up, smiled gently, and said that, of course, but first they needed to build a special space helmet, because this journey would be through unexplored galaxies. In his office, Richard had collapsed at his desk, his body racked with sobs he hadn't allowed himself in months. His son had spoken. After 9 months of tomb-like silence, of failures with the best specialists money could buy, a simple janitor with cleaning supplies had performed a miracle. Oliver descended the remaining stairs slowly, as if his legs were remembering how to work. He approached Michael cautiously, then sat a few feet away, not closer, but enough to see the spaceship better. Michael handed him a cloth, showing him how it could be a flag for their vessel, and together they continued building. They didn't speak much that first day. Oliver said only a few more words, mainly, "here," or "this," while pointing at pieces, but it was a beginning. When lunchtime came, Michael didn't insist Oliver go to the dining room. Instead, he pulled sandwiches from his backpack, simple peanut butter and jelly, and they ate sitting on the marble floor, the spaceship between them like a bridge between two worlds. Richard watched them eat in silence, seeing his son take food with interest for the first time in months. Michael told more stories, now about planets made of pizza and oceans of chocolate milk, almost making Oliver smile. Almost. That afternoon, Michael had to continue his janitorial duties, but he made a deal with Oliver. Every day at the same time, they would work on their ship for an hour. Oliver nodded solemnly and returned to his room, but not to the window. Instead, he sat on his bed, holding the cloth flag Michael had given him. As Michael cleaned the rest of the mansion, he didn't know Richard was following him on every security camera. He didn't know the pharmaceutical CEO was Googling his name, finding a sparse social media presence that mentioned a 5-year-old son named Luis, photos from the Bronx, a life that seemed impossibly distant from Fifth Avenue luxury. What Richard found next made his blood run cold. In an old news article about the fire, listing the victims and heroes, was the name of the firefighter who died trying to save Catherine. David Torres, 28 years old, survived by a brother, Michael, and a nephew, Luis. The cleaning supplies spaceship suddenly made terrible sense. Michael Torres wasn't just a janitor who was good with kids. He was the brother of the man who died trying to save Catherine, and he'd infiltrated the Sterling mansion for reasons Richard couldn't yet understand. But as Richard watched the security replay of Oliver speaking for the first time in 9 months, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He wouldn't confront Michael. Not yet. Whatever his reasons for being here, he'd done what no one else could do. He'd brought Oliver back from the dead. That night, for the first time, Oliver ate dinner at the table instead of having a tray brought to his room. He didn't speak, but he drew pictures while eating. Messy, chaotic drawings of spaceships and stars, but drawings nonetheless. Richard sat across from him, afraid to break whatever spell Michael had cast. Meanwhile, Michael Torres rode the subway back to the Bronx, exhausted from the performance and the emotional weight of being in that house. In his pocket was a photo of his brother David in his firefighter uniform, the last photo taken before he'd entered the Sterling building and never came out. At his small apartment, his son Luis was waiting with the babysitter, eager to hear about his dad's first day at the new job. Michael hugged him tightly, thinking about another boy who needed hugs, but had no one who knew how to give them anymore. He'd come to the Sterling mansion seeking answers about his brother's death, maybe even revenge. But finding that broken child had changed everything. He hadn't expected to care. But Oliver's silence had spoken to something in him, the same instinct that had made David run into burning buildings. The Torres brothers had always been protectors, even when it cost them everything. 2 months had passed since Michael's first day, and the Sterling mansion had undergone a quiet transformation. Oliver spoke regularly now, though only to Michael and occasionally to his father. He laughed at cartoons, ate with appetite, had even started drawing stories about their spaceship adventures. The routine had settled into something comfortable. Michael would arrive at 7, do his janitorial duties, but always spent an hour with Oliver building and creating. They'd graduated from cleaning supply spaceships to elaborate Lego constructions, entire civilizations of space explorers that covered the playroom floor. Richard had started working from home more often, drawn by the sound of his son's laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for so long. He'd also noticed things about Michael, how he moved through the mansion with purpose beyond cleaning.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
How he sometimes stood in the spot where the old penthouse stairs had been, before the renovation after the fire. One evening in November, after Oliver had gone to bed, Richard found Michael in the main hall, staring at a portrait of Catherine that hung above the fireplace. The janitor thought he was alone, and Richard saw him pull something from his pocket, a photo. Richard cleared his throat, and Michael turned, not startled but resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Without a word, he handed Richard the photo. It was David Torres in his firefighter uniform, standing next to Michael and a small boy who must be Luis. The silence stretched between them as Richard studied the photo, seeing the resemblance between the brothers, understanding flooding through him. When he looked up, Michael's eyes were filled with tears he'd been holding back for months. Michael told his story, simply, without accusation. David had been off duty, but heard the call about the Sterling building on his scanner. He'd known it was Richard Sterling's building, knew there were people trapped. He'd arrived and immediately volunteered to go in, despite his captain's reservations. The last radio transmission from David had been that he'd found someone, that he was bringing her out. Then the ceiling had collapsed. Michael had come to the mansion not for revenge, but to understand, to see the family his brother had died trying to save, to make sense of a sacrifice that had left his son Luis without an uncle who'd been like a second father to him. But finding Oliver had changed everything. He couldn't see a privileged child. He saw a boy destroyed by the same tragedy that had destroyed his family. Richard listened in silence, then surprised them both by apologizing. Not the corporate apology of liability and lawyers, but the raw apology of one man to another. He spoke of Catherine, of how she'd insisted on going back for her jewelry, family heirlooms she couldn't bear to lose, how he'd been in Tokyo, closing a deal worth billions that now meant nothing. how David Torres had died trying to save someone who valued objects over her own life. They sat together in that ornate hall, two fathers united by loss, as the truth settled between them. When Oliver appeared in his pajamas, drawn by the voices, he found the two men he trusted most sitting together with tears on their faces. Without understanding why, he climbed between them and took a hand from each, building a bridge with his small body. Spring arrived with unusual warmth, and Oliver had made remarkable progress. He'd returned to school, made a friend named James, and his drawings now showed spaceships flying toward bright suns instead of into darkness. The relationship between Richard, Michael, and Oliver had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Michael still officially worked as a janitor, but he spent more time with Oliver than cleaning. Richard had quietly tripled his salary and offered to pay for Luis's private school tuition, which Michael had proudly refused. It was Oliver himself who brought the hidden truth fully into the light. One afternoon in May, while building their latest Lego creation, he looked at Michael with those two wise eyes and said something that stopped both men cold. Uncle David was brave, wasn't he? He tried to save Mommy. Michael froze, Lego pieces scattering from his shocked hands. Richard, who'd been reading nearby, looked up sharply. They'd never told Oliver about the connection, had agreed to wait until he was older, more stable. Oliver continued with the devastating logic of children. He'd heard the name David Torres at the memorial service, had seen Michael's photo of David, had noticed how Michael sometimes looked sad when Oliver talked about the fire. He'd put it together with the brutal clarity that only children possess. Instead of being angry or upset, Oliver moved closer to Michael and hugged him. "Thank you for coming to help me," he whispered. "Uncle David sent you, didn't he?" Michael broke down completely, holding Oliver while tears streamed down his face. Richard joined them, and for the first time since the fire, they cried together openly, without secrets between them. Summer brought a proposition that shocked everyone. Richard, after months of watching Michael with Oliver, made an offer that went far beyond employment. He wanted Michael and Luis to move into the mansion, not as servants, but as family. Oliver needed stability, needed Michael, and Luis deserved better than their cramped Bronx apartment. Michael's pride fought against the offer, but Luis, who'd finally met Oliver, made the decision simple. The two boys had bonded instantly, Oliver finding in Luis the brother he'd never had, Luis discovering a friend who understood loss in a way his school classmates couldn't. The arrangement was formalized not with contracts, but with a family dinner, where all four of them sat at the Sterling dining table, eating takeout Chinese food and laughing at Luis's impression of his teacher. Richard Sterling, who'd once dined with presidents and billionaires, later said it was the best meal of his life. Before anyone could object, Oliver stood with 7-year-old solemnity and made an announcement. He wanted Michael to be his second dad, not replacing his mom, but filling the empty space she'd left. And he wanted Luis as his brother. The adults exchanged glances, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of a child who'd learned that families could be rebuilt from broken pieces. Paul brought an unexpected challenge. Catherine's parents, Connecticut blue bloods who'd never approved of their daughter marrying new money Richard, learned about Michael's presence and threatened legal action for custody of Oliver. The legal battle that followed was brutal, but revealing. During discovery, it emerged that the fire hadn't been a simple electrical fault. The building's fire suppression system had been deactivated for maintenance by the company Catherine's father owned, delayed to save money. Their negligence had caused both Catherine and David's deaths. The revelation destroyed the Worthingtons, who withdrew all claims and disappeared into their Connecticut estate. But it also freed Michael and Richard from the guilt they'd carried. They weren't responsible. They were all victims of greed and negligence. That night, in the garden Richard had built, where the penthouse had been, he and Michael talked until dawn. Not as employer and employee, but as two men who'd found brotherhood in the strangest circumstances. Richard spoke of expanding his foundation to support firefighters' families. Michael talked about going back to school to become a child psychologist, inspired by his work with Oliver. As the sun rose over Manhattan, they shook hands on a new arrangement. Michael would no longer be a janitor, but Oliver's legal guardian alongside Richard, with full support to pursue his education. The Sterling mansion would be home to their unconventional family. Christmas arrived with a rare Manhattan snowfall and an even rarer gathering. Richard had invited David's firehouse, the entire station of men and women who'd known his brother. Michael almost fled when he saw them arriving, fearing their judgment. But the captain, a grizzled veteran named Murphy, crossed the mansion's grand hall and embraced Richard first, thanking him for the foundation in David's memory. Then Michael, telling him David would be proud to see him helping the boy David had died trying to save. During Christmas Eve dinner, as children played and snow continued to fall, Murphy said something that changed everything. Looking at the four of them, Richard, Michael, Oliver, and Luis, sitting together like a real family, he said David had always believed in signs. He'd say this was meant to be, that from the worst fires come the strongest foundations. Christmas morning, Oliver woke to find not just presents, but an official document. Michael was now legally his co-guardian with Richard. Luis discovered he was officially Oliver's brother through a unique chosen family adoption Richard's lawyers had created. The boys hugged and declared it the best Christmas ever. 2 years later, in the mansion's ballroom, Michael graduated with his psychology degree, Richard and the boys cheering from the front row. Oliver, now 9, gave a speech at the celebration that brought tears to every eye. He spoke of how fire had taken his first family, but given him a bigger one. A dad who learned to hug again, an uncle dad who taught him to fly spaceships, and a brother who showed him that family isn't always about blood. The Torres Sterling Foundation became the largest supporter of firefighter families in New York. The David Torres Center for Traumatized Children, built where the penthouse had burned, helped dozens of children find their voices again, just as Michael had helped Oliver. 5 years after the fire, a family photo showed them all at Luis's middle school graduation. Richard without his corporate armor, Michael in a suit that finally fit properly, Oliver tall and confident at 11, and Luis beaming with pride. Behind them, barely visible, hung 2 portraits, Catherine in her wedding dress and David in his firefighter uniform, watching over the impossible family their sacrifice had created. On the mansion's playroom wall, Oliver had written in marker, with permission, "Families aren't always the ones you're born with. Sometimes they're the ones who show up when you need them most. Sometimes they come from fire, and those are the strongest ones of all." The story of how a janitor saved a traumatized millionaire's son became legend in Manhattan society. But the truth was simpler. Love can grow from shared pain. Forgiveness is stronger than revenge. And sometimes the people destiny sends in our darkest moments are exactly who we need to find the light. And in that Fifth Avenue mansion, where silence once reigned, now rang with the laughter of boys, the sound of Lego spaceships being built, and the certainty that some families, those forged in fire, truly are unbreakable. The last photo taken that Christmas showed all 4 of them in the playroom, surrounded by the elaborate Lego city they'd built together. Michael and Richard sitting on the floor like kids, Oliver and Luis conducting a spaceship between the buildings. On the wall behind them, a sign Luis had made, the Torres Sterling Space Academy, where every co-pilot matters. Below it, in Oliver's careful handwriting, "In memory of Mom and Uncle David, who taught us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear firefighter uniforms, and sometimes they carry mops and build spaceships from cleaning supplies. Hit like if you believe miracles can rise from tragedies. Comment with the moment that touched your heart the most. Share with those who need to know that pain can transform into love." Subscribe for more stories that prove destiny knows how to weave impossible tapestries. Because in the end, What the single dad janitor did that day wasn't just make a traumatized child speak. It was prove that love can rise from ashes, that forgiveness is stronger than revenge, and that sometimes the people destiny sends us in our darkest moments are exactly who we needed to find our way back to the light.